Great. So let's move ahead. Well, we are with the Tahirih Justice Center. We're a national organization focused on uh, legal and social services for immigrant survivors of gender-based violence. Our program is the Forced Marriage Initiative. We're a national program. We're housed in the Northern Virginia area, but we provide services to anyone impacted by the issue of forced marriage in the United States. And though we are here to talk more about the ways that our training and technical assistance can support your work with survivors, we want to make sure that everyone is aware that we do provide direct services. And so you could always contact us if you are working with someone who may be at risk. If you need some maybe referral information or any case management support, please know that we are a resource for you too and for that person as well. And so, the Forced Marriage Initiative is a program at Tahirih that was established in 2011. And we were, created really to ensure that there was a response in the United States to the issue of forced marriage. We currently are co-chairs of the Girls Not Brides USA network. We chair the National Forced Marriage Working Group. And if anyone on the call is interested in learning more about that working group, please feel free to email us. I'm happy to share about what the the working group does and our community agreements with you. But uh, more excitingly, I would say, is that since the 2022 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act, also known as VAWA, we uh, are a training and technical assistance provider funded by the Office of Violence Against Women, right? That 2022 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act defined and named forced marriage for the first time. And it is a wonderful recognition that I think is maybe spearheading more service providers to understand that this issue does impact individuals right here in the United States. And we are very proud to be, I think, at the forefront of those efforts alongside survivors and many partners throughout the nation as we have some of you on the line, as I mentioned earlier, Dr. Amin with Daya. And so when you hear the words or when you read the words training and technical assistance, what that means, in a nutshell is that you can contact us for any guidance as it relates to the issue of forced marriage. And so I mentioned that we are a direct services provider, but the assistance that we can provide from the technical side relates to you and your organization or the advocacy that you provide in your community or your personal life or through whatever network that you are part of. And you can see us as a resource to inform any assessment tools, to inform any protocols to ensure that the voices of those impacted by forced marriage are appropriately named for any customized training for your staff. So these trainings that we are doing, or the one that we're doing right now, for example, is an advanced session, but it's also very general. And so if you are, let's say, working with a particular population, we can customize a training to meet those needs, right? Or if you are maybe a provider, maybe a law enforcement service provider or healthcare provider, we can incorporate pieces in training that are more specific to your role. And so you can also see us as a hub or a place to obtain resources and up-to-date information on state laws and the current landscape in the United States. Be connected to culturally appropriate trained service providers, colleagues who many are part of the forced marriage working group. Others are colleagues from, our work that we know handle this issue with care and support those impacted appropriately. And I think another a very exciting point is that again, since the Violence Against Women Act names and has defined forced marriage, we could also be a thought partner in thinking about or coming up perhaps with solutions to how funding may support forced marriage survivors, right? And so I think that is another great piece of the potential reasons folks may want to connect with us. And so this is the part two of, forced marriage in the United States. A month ago, we hosted the part one, where we dove deeper into the field assessment that team conducted to get our technical and training assistance going. And so I'm not going to spend, a lot of time on pieces that were covered during the part one. But I did want to make sure that folks who were on the call today knew that our training and our trainings that are coming up after this do stem from a field assessment that we conducted to begin our webinar series. And what we found that was, exciting is that folks did know, a lot of folks, want to say was maybe close to 80% of folks knew about the issue of forced marriage. But we noticed that significant training needs still remained, given that 78% of individuals did not trust that their own screening or intake processes would be able to identify forced marriage cases. Um, Only about 4% of those who responded to that field assessment had a working definition of forced marriage. And that says to us that folks are still maybe confused about what this type of abuse is. And there's still a lack of understanding of how this issue does connect with other forms of gender-based violence. And so I will talk a bit more about that because I think it is critical for folks to remember the intersection, even though we did go into detail during the part one. And so to move us ahead, before we dive into the core of the presentation, I did want to recognize that it is possible that we will be utilizing gendered language. And, we recognize that all individuals impacted by forced marriage deserve advocacy, protection, support. Uh, but the truth does remain that the overwhelming majority of people impacted by forced marriage or targeted, I should say, by forced marriage are women or girls, or perhaps they are perceived to be women and girls. And so that is why you may hear us using gendered language or she, her pronouns. This is a never to minimize the experiences of men and boys or folks who are gender non-binary or non-conforming. It is just what we know from our work and the reality of who is often targeted. Okay. And so let's get started with some, grounding definition uh, about the issue. And so at the Tahirih Justice Center, when we are speaking about a forced marriage, we are defining this as a marriage where one or both people do not or cannot consent to the marriage. And typically, this involves elements of force, elements of fraud, or coercion. At Tahirih, we do not equate a forced marriage with an arranged marriage. We understand that an arranged marriage is a process in which families may take the lead, but the ultimate choice to marry remains with the individuals. And choice here is key. We are not focused on the terminology that is utilized by, you know, the maybe individual at risk, right? They may be naming their situation arranged or maybe utilize the words love marriage or non-consensual. What we're really looking at is the piece on choice and if there is full and free consent at all levels of the marriage process. And so let's break that down a little bit more. And again, I'm not spending too much time on these slides because we did cover this during the part one. So if you feel we're moving quickly, you're welcome to contact us. We're happy to drop the link to the part one in the chat. Happy to chat one-on-one. Because it is really important that folks understand like this, foundation of the issue. But again, I want to ensure that we get to that more advanced section, which is relating more to the laws and showing you all the guide that we created to help service providers with this work. Yeah. And so just to dive a little bit deeper on the, arranged versus forced marriage discussion, what we have included in this presentation is this graphic, the forced marriage continuum, which was provided to us by Vidya Sri, a survivor who was at Harvard at the time that she created this graphic with Dirakshan Raja, who at the time was working at the Urban Institute. And this graphic helps us to understand how someone may find themselves in an arranged marriage process, but over time, if their choice is not being respected, if they are not able to freely express their wishes, if they are fearing any repercussions, that they may be finding themselves more in a situation that is forced, right? Because that piece related to choice is not necessarily there. And, we've heard from individuals impacted that, they at one point, thought they had a choice and they actually did not mind their family or members of their community being involved in their marriage process. But they were told that, they did not have to get married right away, or they were told that they could, wait to finish high school and something has happened in the family or in their life that is now moving the family to, forcing that individual into something that they once thought they had control over, but now they realize that they don't. And I think it can be really, jarring to think that, you thought you had choice and consent at some point, but now the process is moving forward without your control. which hopefully for you all highlights the complexities around this issue, especially when we are talking about, for the most part, loved ones who are the ones pushing or with the motivation for the marriages to occur. Mm. And just so that this, foundational understanding of the issue is clear, we also included this graphic, which we created, which takes a look at, root causes across communities, across societies, that are, really present, right? Regardless of where one may be from. And then we relate those root causes to the individual family triggers to better understand how forced marriage can be used as another tool of power, a tool of control, a tool of oppression. And so if you're thinking, well, why do these, situations happen? This graphic can help you better understand that. Again, it's not a perfect, image. It may not be encompassing all ways or all reasons why a family may, move forward with marriage demands. But hopefully it's clear that truly, like many forms of gender-based violence, this issue is rooted in gender inequality, in patriarchal values, control over female sexuality, and in some places, custom and tradition, or exacerbated by, poverty and conflict. And so before I move us ahead, I would love for my colleague Brianna to join us and share maybe an example that may, come to mind when thinking about the root causes and individual family triggers.
Yes, thank you. Hi, everyone. My name is Brianna Roberts, and I am the Forced Marriage Initiative Associate. A large part of my role includes direct case management work with the people impacted by forced marriage. So, this includes developing safety plans, assisting them with connection to services, and coordinating with service providers to ensure that their needs are being met.
Yeah.
I,
Uh,
mhm.
Thank you, Bri. I think before, I really appreciate you naming that you're working directly with those who we serve. I think before you share the example, I'm going to ask you to please slow down a little bit, given that we do have interpretation going. Thank you.
Thank you. Sorry about that. I really like this graphic because it speaks to what I see with my work with survivors. A common root cause I often see in my casework touches upon the concept of gender inequality. The people that I work with are some of the most intelligent and bright individuals I have the pleasure of supporting. Unfortunately, this could mean that my clients are being sought out in ways that could lead to harmful consequences. So I immediately think of a client, and we can call her Trina, who is an extremely gifted student that excels in all of her coursework. Because of this, fellow classmates of all genders often seek her out to ask for support with their schoolwork. We later learned that Trina's older brother attends the same school as her and is tasked with watching over her, which could seem, caring at first. However, he is reporting Trina's actions back to the family. So one day, after witnessing Trina studying with a boy, in his eyes, she seemed a little bit too flirty, a little bit too giggly. So he told his family. And for Trina's family, this was seen as unacceptable behavior, and they were worried about their reputation if community members found out Trina was flirting with a boy. And for Trina's parents, they started pressuring her into a forced marriage. And this is a common case example that we see very frequently. And it also explains how cases can immediately escalate based on an individual family level triggers and based on what they view as unacceptable behaviors.
Thank you, Brie. I think that is a really clear and clean example that I too have seen in my work here with the Forced Marriage Initiative. And I hope that it's clear for folks that again, every family is different, even if folks are from the same community. But that root cause is important to understand. Uh, but perhaps more important is that trigger for the family, right? What will they do in order to, um, get that person to comply, or what is the reason that they see, something needing to be corrected? So, moving us ahead, I mentioned the piece on consent earlier, and I did see that my colleagues dropped the link to the part one, which goes into this area a bit more detailed. But again, so we are all on the same page. Consent is across the board. It is not just about the person who they may be introduced to. It's even about like the idea of marriage and the timing and freely being able to express wishes without negative consequences. And I think even more important, without fear of negative consequences. If there is a fear, if there is some sort of doubt, that to me as a service provider tells me that there's something else going on and leads me to wanting to ask a bit more, which we will share with you all a guide, I think a wonderful guide that we created to help all of you in doing this work. To expand a bit more on consent and what the lack of consent can look like, we named the definition as including force, fraud, or coercion. Another piece could also be uh, someone be, having some sort of incapacity or disability that does not maybe allow them to fully understand what they are consenting to. We also could see their incapacity or disability be used by parents or family or abusive individuals to get someone to comply. And lack of consent can also be caused by someone being younger than the legal age to marry. And so I would love for my colleague Alex to share a bit more about just child marriage in the United States, given that lack of consent can also be impacting individuals who are, younger than the legal age to marry. So, Alex, let me pass it to you.
Thank you, Halitz. I will introduce myself quickly. I'm Alex Goyette. I'm the Public Policy Manager with Tahirih. So my work focuses on um, taking the work done by my colleagues in direct services and translating that into public policy changes that um, allow those at risk at forced marriage to better reach safety as they define it. And a lot of my work focuses on child marriage specifically, and I think it's always useful to start with a definition to make sure we're all talking about the same thing. So when I say child marriage, that might conjure the image of a very young child, and that does happen in the United States. But to be clear, I'm talking about the marriage of any person who is under the age of majority in their state. For most states, that's age 18. And child marriage in the United States is legal in the majority of states, and it does happen in every state where it's legal. Typically, the children being married in these cases are teenagers, 16 or 17 years old for the majority of these cases. We at Tahirih do not claim that every single child marriage is necessarily a forced marriage, but we do have data from across the country that gives us some indications that a lot of these cases have what I would call at least concerning factors that may point to possible coercion. Between 2000 and 2018, over 300,000 minors were married across the United States. And when we look at that data, we see that most of these cases involve an underage girl. Depending on the state, 80 to 85% of children married are girls. And most of these are marrying an adult man. So what we're not seeing typically are, a sort of high school romance situation of two 17-year-olds in senior year getting married. We are seeing girls being married to adult men typically. Some of these adults are decades older than the girls that they're marrying, and this is allowed to happen because of state laws that include exceptions to minimum marriage ages. Um, Particularly concerning are states where the minimum marriage age is lower than the state's age of sexual consent, allowing marriage to take place between a couple where sex would be a criminal act. And in particular, many states still rely on parental consent as a supposed safeguard for children being forced into marriage. And as my colleagues mentioned, unfortunately, when a child is facing forced marriage, the most common perpetrator in these cases are their own parents. And so relying on parental consent as a supposed safeguard in the law is in many cases, in fact, simply enabling parental coercion. There has been a lot of research on child marriage in the United States. Um, Academics have found that regardless of whether a particular marriage is forced, when the person is marrying underage, they face a variety of lifelong and sometimes devastating impacts. Some of the health impacts that have been found include a 23% greater risk of developing a serious health condition over the lifetime. Teen girls who marry also often lose control of their bodily autonomy. They have more children earlier and more closely spaced than their peers who do not marry. Women and girls aged 16 to 19 also face intimate partner violence at nearly 3 times the national rate. Child marriage also has significant mental health impacts. Women who marry underage present with more psychiatric disorders over the course of their life, including mood and anxiety disorders. And agencies that do direct services with girls facing forced marriage report that nearly all of the minors that they work with have at least contemplated and often attempted suicide. For a lot of people thinking about marriage as a public policy issue, they may hold the value that marriage is a fundamental building block of society, of healthy families. And so, for those who do have that value, I think it's important to know that the marriages themselves are not typically successful either. 70 to 80% of child marriages end in divorce, and nearly a quarter of these marriages end in divorce very quickly, with the marriage ending before the child even turns 18 and becomes an adult. Married children are also isolated from the support networks that we all rely on, but particularly children, especially school friends and family who typically are instrumental in building a child up into adulthood. Married children are instead isolated with that spouse and unable to access these support networks in the same way as an unmarried minor. Um, Child marriage also increases the risk of other forms of violence and often results in cyclical and intergenerational harm. We have worked with many, many survivors who talk about their own family's history of forced or child marriage, and talk about, for example, their own mother, grandmother, aunts who were also forced into marriage as a child. And then lastly, I'll talk a bit about the economic impacts of child marriage. Girls who marry underage are 31% more likely to live in future poverty, and teen mothers who marry then divorce more than double their own likelihood of future poverty compared to teen mothers who do not marry. Then finally, girls who marry under age 19 are 50% more likely to drop out of high school and about 4 times less likely to graduate from college, which obviously, again, has repercussions on their earning capabilities throughout the course of their life. Any case of a person facing a forced marriage can be complex and potentially dangerous, but when a case is of a minor facing forced marriage, it becomes even more so. Children facing forced marriage are more at risk than adults in similar situations for a number of reasons. Nobody magically wakes up on their 18th birthday a changed and more powerful person, but that day is the exact time that the state grants them the legal rights of an adult. And those are very important for someone who is seeking to resist an unwanted marriage or to leave an abusive situation. 18 is also when society in general grants someone the social legitimacy of adulthood, and that again can be very important in accessing the services and rights that someone needs to resist an unwanted marriage. Children not only do not have the same legal rights as adults, they often lack knowledge of what legal rights they do have. And this is not because kids aren't smart. This is because the rights that a child has are complicated and they vary depending on age and depending on their exact location, particularly their state. A 16-year-old in Florida is not going to have the same rights as a 16-year-old in Washington and or as a 17-year-old in the same state. And so that makes it very difficult for a minor to self-help and to know what their own rights are. We also find that law enforcement typically defers to the rights of parents. If a minor leaves a home where they're facing a forced marriage, they can be returned right back to that home to their parents who are forcing them into marriage as a runaway under most state laws. Minors facing forced marriage are also typically living with the perpetrators of that forced marriage. As we mentioned, in these cases, it is most often the parents who are forcing the child into marriage, and so they have an additional reliance on their perpetrators that may not be the case for an adult. And children are in general more reliant on other people, their parents, their family, their community, for social and economic support. It's very difficult, for example, for a minor to rent a place on their own, to be working enough to support themselves. And so this makes them all the more vulnerable to forced marriage. And then finally, simply by virtue of being children and having spent less time in the world, minors tend to have less experience navigating the world independently, which of course is again another way that they have less personal power to access the services and the supports that they need to resist an unwanted marriage. And with that, I will toss it back to Halitz.
Yeah. Thank you so much, Alex. I want to, recognize for folks who may have other questions related to, child marriage, that we are going to speak more about the laws in general related to forced marriage, but also related to child marriage, as well as the growing, changing landscape in the United States a bit ahead of the presentation. And, you may be wondering, well, why then are we talking about child marriage at this point if we are going to talk about laws later? And I think the simple answer to that is because often when we are providing, services, folks, categorize those who they work with either as, I'm working with adults or I'm working with minors or I serve youth and children. I serve adults. And what we see in cases related to forced, child marriage is that, there at times there's this missing puzzle piece that folks are not necessarily asking, naming, or even recognizing that you could be working with an adult who was forced to marry as a child, right? Who has this complex trauma experience, and perhaps your screening, your intake, or whatever process you utilize to provide services is not necessarily uncovering that, or you're not recognizing it as a, a need or something currently impacting that person. And the reality is that that um, you know is a part of the complexities of trauma, right? And so, we've been talking about case dynamics throughout this presentation. What you may see if you come across someone who is impacted by forced marriage. But when we think about or when we talk about trauma, we are talking about these adverse experiences, right? And they are so overwhelming for a person, for their body, for their mind. And this like pushes them out of that window of tolerance to be able to cope with just day-to-day stress. Potentially puts them at greater maybe risk or vulnerability for other perpetrators or other types of abuse. And, when we were thinking about trauma, or as I reflect on what my colleague Alex shared related to child marriage, I think about how, many of the folks I've worked with throughout my career at this organization, but even at the domestic violence center that I worked at, I never asked about the onset of someone's marriage. I never asked about, or looked into the age that someone, was married. I was very focused on supporting them with the current pressing issue. And when I think about like what trauma really is, right? That it's not just one thing, but it is really a series, right, of events, or it can be felt in as multiple experiences or circumstances along someone's life, right? That impacts how they respond, their functioning, their mental, physical, and emotional health. I think is really important for us to, to pause and really think about how we are or not providing true holistic services, and if we are potentially missing some of the trauma history that a person who we may be working with has experienced or is experiencing. And when it comes to child marriage, we're talking about something that's legal, right? But as my colleague named, lots of um, serious consequences. And so to stay with this piece a bit more on how forced marriage, regardless of folks' age, right? How the forced marriage uh, abuse, the dynamics that play intersect with other forms of violence, I want to make sure that it is clear for folks that forced marriage in itself is a form of violence, right? The very act is one that implies a great deal of power imbalance and control over someone else. Um, but even though we know that, this is never happening by itself, meaning that the forced marriage is always happening alongside other types of abuse. And more likely than not, the different types of abuse that are named on this slide, these are the forms of violence that are presenting themselves first. And by that, I mean someone may be reaching out to a hotline, to a domestic violence service provider because of domestic violence or intimate partner violence, right? It may not be that they are reaching out directly because of a forced marriage, which is why we continue to emphasize the need for adequate screening and intake and assessment, because you likely are working with someone who is also impacted by forced marriage and not necessarily know it, right? And so, uh, forced marriage certainly can um, imply a great deal of loss of control over one's life, over one's body, education, whether they have, children or not. And again, it's not usually that presenting problem. You could be working with someone who is maybe coming to you because they were sexually assaulted. And, we can have a lot of assumptions as to, how that person can be helped. And we may immediately think that we need to, contact support, maybe family, to support this person. But, that person may be, coming from a family where that sexual assault may be a trigger for a forced marriage. They may want to, in their eyes, protect the family reputation and maybe even protect the perpetrator. Perhaps that person is known in the community or holds a lot of power, or maybe they are a pastor or some sort of spiritual leader that the parents will want to protect over their own daughter. And so I think that recognizing the intersection of forced marriage with other forms of abuse is critical, and can certainly open up the doors for more individuals impacted to reach out for support and for services. Um, uh, Unfortunately, I think if folks do not see themselves, on websites, on, intake documentation, if they do not see, the words, forced marriage or non-consensual marriage, then perhaps they're not going to, reach out. They may not know that there is support. And I mentioned again, Violence Against Women Act does define forced marriage now. It does name it as a type of abuse that can intersect with domestic violence, with stalking, dating violence, and sexual violence, right? And so it is critical for us to, keep up with these changes and to ensure that we are naming uh, this appropriately so that folks can truly see themselves as able to receive support, right? What we don't want is for individuals to maybe potentially reach out for support and their situation is not seen as within scope of services, or it's not seen as bad, and that the perception of future harm, right? Like the future fear of being forced to marry, the future fear of what will be expected as a spouse in a forced relationship, for that not to be seen as, enough for that person to get support, which I think in my work, it is an incredible moment of prevention, a very unique moment that we often do not have when we are providing, services in the gender-based violence space. A moment to know of, hey, this person fears a future sexual assault that we can actually do something about like right now. That is very, very rare. And so I just can't emphasize enough how important the asking about the marriage, asking about how marriage comes to be, and thinking about individuals, like their perception of risk and how important that is. And I name that knowing that a lot of our processes ask us to, evaluate things on a danger or lethality scale. But this piece here on the future risk is often lost. And so I'd love for my colleague, Brianna, to come on in just a few to share a bit about, the warning signs as I, wrap up this piece related to coercive tactics. I think it's clear from what we've shared thus far that, the cases that we are often, working with or that you all may be working with do involve several, dynamics that maybe apart may not seem critical enough, but when taken together, you may start maybe formulating if this does fall in line with some of these definitions of maybe child abuse or family violence or other things. When it comes to cases of forced marriage, and I know that my colleague will expand a bit further, the threat is coming from many sources, and that is something that at times is a bit different than the typical maybe domestic violence or family violence cases that you are working with or experience in, right? We're talking often about parents, siblings, other loved ones who may truly believe that marriage is in the best interest of their child. And I'm saying the words child, but that could mean an adult as well, right? And so there is a lot of tug and pull and pressures, and it is not uncommon for folks to, reach out for support and perhaps feel they are, like frozen or have that decision paralysis, is what we name it, which is also another example of trauma and trauma response, right? And so I'm going to pass it to you, Brianna, to go into some of the warning signs, knowing that we actually did not talk about warning signs on the last webinar. So let me pass that to you so you can expand a bit further here.
Yes, thank you.
Of course.
So, in my work as the Forced Marriage Initiative Associate, I work day in and day out in this issue. And there are a number of red flags that come up in different areas of a person's life. So, what we are trying to do with these next few slides is to make you aware of some of the common red flags that are present with people who are impacted by this form of harm. And before we begin, I just want to note that one red flag or warning sign is not indicative of a forced marriage threat, as these threats are, common across all forms of gender-based violence. However, if there are several present, then we encourage you to start asking the right questions to everybody who is showing these signs. I want to start off with the law enforcement column. Unfortunately, parents are very savvy and they often use law enforcement and its reporting systems against the individuals at risk. We frequently see, false reports whenever an individual has decided to flee or relocate for their own safety. We also see families frame potential victims as perpetrators, so thinking of drug users or sex workers or frequent runaways. It is not uncommon for families to use these systems to make the individual at risk known to law enforcement, which could lead law enforcement to dismissing the individual's concerns, labeling it as like a family matter, or the person being rebellious against a parent, and then they dismiss future reports against the family. Moving to the family history side, having a having a history of early and forced marriages among siblings or close relatives, both within the family, the immediate family, as well as the spouse family, is a red flag. So it's extremely important to assess the full marriage history of the families, so you'll know if the individual who is impacted might be facing a forced marriage. The death of a parent is one of the biggest signs for us. For certain families, the ultimate goal is for a parent is to witness their child being married. And, this is for the intent of ensuring that that person is established and cared for, when the parent is gone. We've also seen, a parent who the death of a supportive parent be a trigger for a forced marriage as well, because that parent is no longer there to shield the individual from the pressures of marriage being placed upon them by family or other community members. So, as we continue to discuss warning signs, you'll see that these next few slides might be a little bit obvious for service providers, social workers, or anyone else who is working with this population. Starting off with education and employment, a sudden change in behavior can often look like the individual no longer being excited about educational or professional growth opportunities that you know that they had. And this could lead to, a decline in grades or their job performance. We've often seen unreasonable house restrictions be used as a form of punishment by not allowing the individual to attend school or go to work, or their trauma has impacted their mental health to the point where they decide to skip school or work, and this will cause them to have several unexplained absences. The fear of upcoming breaks and holidays is a huge indicator for us. Families often use the extended time their child receives for summer and winter breaks to travel to a family's home country to either finalize marriage plans or to get engaged. And often individuals are not being told of the real reason why they're traveling. They might be told that they're visiting a sick relative. However, the individual at risk just knows in their gut that a marriage will take place if they go overseas. And this could be due to them overhearing conversations or they're witnessing parents buy, wedding gifts, things of that nature. And international abandonment is very common in cases with overseas dynamics. So, if you are working with a student or an employee and they express to you that they are nervous about an upcoming break and you know a little bit about their family history, such as there's violence in the home, a little deeper and ask questions about why they are fearing the upcoming break. Shifting to health issues, it's impossible to go through this work. Um, it's impossible for individuals to experience this harm without it impacting their mental health. The coercive behaviors leading up to a forced marriage, takes an incredible toll on an individual's mental health. And several survivors have shared with me that they struggle with depression and anxiety and have disclosed other serious mental health conditions. They've even expressed to me that they have, attempted self-harm, and sometimes attempted suicide as well. And, survivors also lose their bodily autonomy and they are not allowed to make decisions based on their health. And, they are being accompanied by family members to doctor's appointments, and they are not given the opportunity to share with health providers their concerns in a safe and confidential manner. And lastly, I just want to touch upon early unwanted and concealed pregnancy. We may have a lot of assumptions as to why a person is hiding or feel uneasy about their pregnancy. In forced marriage cases, a pregnancy could be a trigger or the result of an unwanted marriage. Survivors may become pregnant after willingly engaging in sexual intercourse with a chosen partner, but once the family finds out, they might be pressured to marry that individual or to get married altogether in order to save their reputation. Unwanted pregnancy may also be the result of a rape or sexual assault. And, the family are using it as a guise to, cover up a perpetrator's crime or the crime overall. And lastly, the pregnancy could be the result of an unwanted marriage that the person was forced into. Someone dealing with this inside of a forced marriage may have few avenues to reach out for support, and they might feel stuck and they might have to remain into the marriage. So it's really critical that you assess for the amount of support that the individual has and assess for the nature of the relationships on all levels. And I want to pass it to Alex, who will talk more about the current laws.
Thank you, Bree. So the issue of forced and child marriage is only really becoming more mainstream in the US over the last decade, maybe 2 decades, if we're being generous. And so the legal framework that we have in place in the United States at all levels of government, from federal all the way down to local, is somewhat limited. So I'm going to start by talking about the laws that are currently in place, and then I'll also share some of the ways that laws have been changing, especially in the last few years, as the issue becomes more mainstream and as lawmakers and advocates and survivors are increasingly pushing for laws that better serve folks facing forced marriage. So I'll start with a quick, really 30,000-foot view of the legal landscape. Unfortunately, I won't be able to go into a ton of detail for any particular law, but I just want to give people an idea of what the law looks like right now. Forced marriage was only recently defined in federal law as part of the 2022 reauthorization of the Violence Against Women Act. It was named as a cause and consequence of domestic violence, dating violence, sexual assault, and stalking in VAWA. Um, the reauthorization also required the Attorney General to submit a report to Congress annually that examines state laws on minimum marriage age and whether these conflict with criminal laws on age-based sex offenses. So that's one of the legal shortcomings I highlighted earlier. We now do have the federal government leaning in to at least report on this issue. State laws on protection orders vary widely in how applicable they are and how accessible they are to people facing forced marriage. These civil remedies are often more accessible and survivor-centered than relying on criminal law, but the differences between state laws can make them difficult to use for survivors in some situations. Different limitations include things like who is able to apply for a protection order, who can be restrained by one of these orders, and the actions or relationships that can be covered by the order. And this ties directly to some of the different case dynamics that we see in forced marriage cases compared to other forms of violence. For example, when a case of forced marriage may have multiple perpetrators throughout the community, often protection orders have a bit more difficulty in addressing that type of multiple perpetrator situation. Other federal and state laws may not directly address forced marriage, but they can be useful in these situations when one considers how forced marriage often overlaps with other crimes. Laws that address other acts related to forced marriage, such as kidnapping, abduction, sexual assault, trafficking, or assault in general, can be an important tool for both advocates and survivors in forced marriage situations. And finally, age of marriage laws, again, vary widely by state. I'll go into a bit more specific detail on these in a moment. When it comes to criminal law, there are currently 11 US jurisdictions that have a criminal statute that specifically addresses forced marriage. And there are three more states with laws that are specific to abduction for the purpose of marriage of a minor. So again, this is something that is addressed in some states directly, but the majority of states are relying on other pieces of their statute to address these forced marriage cases. It's important to note that in Tahirih's experience, very few victims of forced marriage are interested in pursuing criminal charges against their perpetrators. They often maintain complex feelings toward the family or community members who are perpetrating a forced marriage against them. And in our experience, they do generally want that marriage to be stopped, of course, but they often don't want the perpetrators to face criminal consequences. That said, criminal laws can be useful as a sort of bargaining tool for advocates and for people who are facing forced marriage. And being able to simply point to a law and say what you are doing is illegal can be really powerful in negotiating with a perpetrator. So while many forced marriage victims do not express interest in pursuing criminal charges, it's important that when victims do seek help from police, prosecutors, and courts, and some of them do choose this criminal law approach, it's critical that they are able to access protection and justice, and that what they experience does not get excused or dismissed as simply a family or cultural matter. When we as advocates are considering criminal responses to forced marriage, we would urge a lot of care and caution, and especially consultation with survivors, with impacted communities, and with expert stakeholders to avoid the unintended consequences of criminalization that can impact both victims' communities and the victims themselves. And we can also derive a lot of lessons learned from other countries who have pursued criminal law on forced marriage at the national level. Examples of these include Australia, Canada, and the United Kingdom has a criminal law that is partnered with a protection order system that they have in place as well. So a bit more on the laws related to child marriage in the United States. And again, I'll remind you that when I'm saying child, I just mean anyone under the age of majority, which is typically 18. These underage marriages have been made illegal in 13 states. I've listed those states here. On the other hand, if you don't see your state listed, that means it's one of the 37 states and DC that still allow child marriage in some form or another. Setting the minimum age of marriage is a power that is specifically held by state governments, but there is a role for federal law in this issue as well. One important example of that is federal immigration law. From 2007 to 2017, USCIS approved over 8,500 marriage-based visa petitions that involved a minor. And this is able to happen because in immigration law, there is currently no minimum age set for which a petitioner or beneficiary of a spouse or fiance visa needs to hit that age to apply for that visa. And so what that means is US children are able to be entered into a marriage for the purpose of awarding a visa to a foreign adult so that adult can be brought over and immigrate to the United States. And on the flip side, US citizen adults are able to bring over foreign children on marriage and fiancé visas as well. Federal law also does not currently have any prohibition on child marriage happening on federal lands or at federal facilities, and there are no real incentives or supports for states that do want to make change on this issue. So while the existing legal framework on forced marriage is somewhat limited, that is starting to change, and that landscape is shifting rapidly, at least in relation to how quickly any legal framework can change. I'll talk a bit about some examples of the different and innovative approaches that different states and federal lawmakers have taken to these issues, with again a note that this is a rapidly changing area of law. For those who are in the policy solution space, we welcome any requests for training or technical assistance to talk about the different creative approaches that states and agencies across the country have taken in a bit more detail, or to talk more specifically about the legal landscape in your particular state. I'll start again with child marriage laws. I mentioned earlier that 13 states have prohibited child marriage. It's interesting to note that all of these laws were passed since 2018, and more are passing almost every year. 3 more states have ended child marriage this year, bringing that total up to 13. And DC may follow suit either this year or early next year if council there decides to pass a bill that they've introduced. States have also taken a variety of other approaches that seek to limit, but not necessarily end child marriage. These states have decided, for whatever reason, that they want to allow some form of child marriage to continue, which is unfortunate, but they have acknowledged that this is a problem that they want to address, at least partially, and tried to put additional safeguards in place. Since 2015, 35 states total have passed a law that addresses child marriage in some way, either by limiting or ending it entirely. Broadly speaking, these states are improving protections for minors facing forced marriage. And I'll go over the broad strokes of how these changes have happened really since 2015. In 2015, every single state allowed child marriage. There are now 13 states that have banned it entirely, and there are 5 more that have limited marriage to legal adults, which is just anyone who is 18 or who has been emancipated and granted some of the rights of an adult. Even for states that are thus far unwilling to end child marriage entirely, they are generally moving those minimum ages up. So you can see that the number of states that have minimum marriage ages at 16 or 17 has increased since 2015. Meanwhile, the number of states that have no age floor or an age floor under age 16 are both falling. Many states have also gone to work on the exceptions that they explicitly allow to their minimum marriage ages. As recently as 2015, there were still 10 states that allowed the fact that a minor was pregnant to be a justification for entering them into a marriage. That's now down to only 4 states, still including this dangerous exception. We've talked a bit about the dangers of parental consent as a supposed safeguard, and that is also decreasing. In 2015, there were still 41 states that allowed parents to consent to the marriage of an older child, 16 or 17, without any other safeguards in place. That is down to just 24 states now. We also see states tinkering with judicial approval processes, either expanding them to ensure that any minor who marries has to go before a judge, or making sure that the processes include more specific safeguards, and are not just a rubber stamp on the marriage. And so we see that the number of states who are allowing judges to simply approve a marriage without any further examination has fallen from 29 states in 2015 to just 8 states now. And finally, we're seeing states get rid of laws that treat minors of different sexes differently. In 2015, 5 states had a different minimum marriage age for girls than they did for boys. It was universally lower for girls. And we are down to just 1 state now. Mississippi is the last state that still allows girls to marry at a younger age than boys. We have also seen some exciting beginnings of movement on the issue at the federal level. I mentioned that in 2022, forced marriage was finally defined in the Violence Against Women Act. Just this year, we've seen the introduction of the Child Marriage Prevention Act. This has not passed into law and so could certainly change over time as it goes through the legislative process. But it is the first effort by Congress to address child marriage as an issue domestically in both state law and federal law. And so I think it's worth going over the highlights of what the bill as introduced would do. When it comes to changes in state law, the bill would create a national commission to combat child marriage, studying the issue and making recommendations on how child marriage can be eliminated. It would incentivize states to pass their own laws ending child marriage through additional grant funding for states that have ended child marriage. And it would assist states that have not yet ended child marriage but are seeking to do so by creating grants for state task forces that would examine the issue and develop policy recommendations to protect individuals from child marriage and related abuse. And then it also instructs the Attorney General to develop a model statute for states that are looking to prohibit child marriage. So again, just making it easier for those state legislators to implement new laws that end child marriage. The bill would also close some of the federal protection gaps that I had mentioned. It includes a ban of child marriage on federal land and in federal buildings. It also addresses some of the issues in the immigration system by setting minimum age requirements for U.S. petitioners and foreign beneficiaries of spouse and fiancé visas to prevent children from being married solely for immigration purposes. And it also charges the comptroller of the United States with studying and reporting on the prevalence of child marriage within this marriage-based visa program. I also want to highlight a few more unique approaches that 2 different states have taken. In each of these cases, I'm going to mention these are unique laws that we haven't seen passed anywhere else, but that we think are promising and that could be repeated by other states who want to work on this issue. In Texas in 2017, as part of a reform that also limited marriage to legal adults there, so again, allowing marriage for just emancipated minors, the legislature also included forcing or coercing a child into marriage as part of the definition of child abuse. And this had 2 important impacts. It make sure that forced and child marriage falls clearly within the mandate of Family and Protective Services, the state's equivalent of Child Protective Services, ensuring that uh, DFPS workers know that a child being forced into marriage does fall within the field of issues that they should be working on. It also makes protection orders more accessible to children who are facing forced marriage by allowing a DFPS worker or any other adult to file for a protection order on behalf of a minor facing forced marriage. Then in Tennessee, lawmakers sought to address the issue by creating a civil cause of action for survivors of forced marriage. This would allow any party who has been forced into marriage to pursue civil damages against their perpetrator of up to $250,000. This gives survivors a clear recognition of the harm that has been done to them and provides the opportunity to hold perpetrators directly accountable in civil court without necessarily initiating a criminal procedure, which, as I mentioned, many survivors are not keen on doing. And with that, I will pass it back to my colleague Halitz.
Thank you so much, Alex. I want to pause for a moment. I recognize that I um, shifted the chat slightly so that folks can utilize the Q&A a bit better. So please, folks, utilize that Q&A area. We want to make sure that nothing is being missed. So that would be really helpful. And so just taking a small pause to reflect because this piece that Alex just covered is really exciting for me and thinking about, progress and movement and ways that folks can utilize their own, piece of the pie, for lack of other words, or, their uh, for folks in my interpretation room, excuse me for using that that point, perhaps, that folks can utilize, the space where they are at, I should say, for change. And so I will love to hear from folks. I'm going to see if folks maybe can utilize maybe the Q&A or just message directly with host, and we can cover or share that out. But what is, one thing now that we have all of this information, um, is there's one thing that you can do to support individuals at risk of forced marriage in your work? Or what can you do to support those impacted by forced marriage? So I'm going to pause and see if folks have any reflections. Um, I would love to hear from folks on what is something that you think you could do. That could be your work with your agency, maybe in your community, perhaps with any task force or network that you are part of. Recognizing what we've talked about today, is there anything that comes to mind? And ask for folks to go back to the chat since we have a few more slides to cover. But I see Celine naming work on adding forced marriage language to our assessment documents. Magdalena added the intake questionnaire about the onset of marriage. Yeah, thank you for naming that. I think sometimes, especially when we are, having this conversation right after hearing about some of the policy or legislative change, we may think about maybe the macro level change, which is wonderful. If you are working in that policy space, great. But there is a lot that we can do individually. And the reality is the majority of those impacted or those who are at risk, they may be given your organization's like hotline or the local shelters information or their local outreach centers contact. And there is a lot of value in naming more questions around marriage, right? And so I really appreciate those of you who responded, and thank you, Anjali, who named reminding individuals about their rights and the options that they have, because that is really powerful and definitely needed. And so this next slide is a snippet of I think, hotline screening process that we received from a wonderful colleague, Dr. Amin, who is or was on the call earlier with Daya over in Houston. And I were included this snippet to share that right where they are listing the different types of abuse, they included forced marriage, right? And so that is a great way of immediately being able to ask, even if folks don't have a lot of training, but having it listed works twofold. The advocate or the service provider has it in front of them and it's there to ask, right? You don't have to be fully knowledgeable of this issue. It's there. Uh, the service provider then also has to get a bit more education on understanding that type of abuse. And then you have the actual individual impacted at being asked the question and being and seeing that we're recognizing that we get it, that there's more to the type of victimizations that they may be presenting with. So I think that is wonderful, and I'm thankful for Daya, who provided this for us, and to everyone who is thinking about their screening and those protocols. And so I would like to move us ahead and share this intake and assessment tool that we created. And I know that we are close to time. So for all of you on the call, please know that we will send the recording and we will include the tool, the intake and assessment tool that we have created. And so, but before I share screen, given that we are going to share this tool with everyone, I do want to pause and see if we have questions in the Q&A that we have not addressed. So I am looking to my colleagues, Alex and Brianna, to please let me know or to come on and see if there's things that we should be naming or uplift or emphasize a bit more for folks before we move into sharing of the assessment tool.
Yeah, thank you, Halitz. I think there's one really great question here that hasn't been addressed already that either you or Bree may be able to speak to. Um, they ask, how can we provide support for victims of forced marriage when it is a cultural or religious marriage as opposed to a legal marriage done through the court system?
Alex, for the sake of interpretation, could you please ask that question one more time? I actually cannot see it, so that will be really helpful to.
Yes. How can we provide support for victims of forced marriage when the marriage is cultural or religious and not a legal marriage through the court system?
You know, that is a really wonderful question, and I will name that many of the survivor advocates who we work with name the need for more work to be done when it comes to religious uh, marriages or cultural marriages. I think I'll start off by ensuring that we are being cautious when using the words, or I'm being cautious when using the words culture, because, what culture are we speaking about? That is something to keep in mind. I know at our work at Tahirih, we are very careful with ensuring that if there is a need for specific cultural expertise, that we do connect with service providers trained on this issue who can speak to the culture in an authentic way. And so that's one piece that I'll name. And I think the other piece is that ultimately, if someone is naming that they have been forced or they are being forced or they are involved in some sort of process that is not consensual, regardless of going through the courts or not, I would want folks to be able or know that they can provide that person with assistance. I would like for that person to also know that they are a part of their culture, a part of their community, and they too get to shape what that culture and what that community accepts or rejects. In our work, we certainly have seen service providers um, be stuck when something appears to be like cultural or perhaps forced marriage be tucked into like a spiritual issue, when in reality that is not the case. No religion sanctions forced marriage. Consent is required. I'm seeing Dr. Amin, who provides services with a focus on South Asian communities, naming in the chat that in Islam, consent of both parties is necessary. And we know from our work with various religious leaders that that is true. And so I think that we don't want to be stuck because we feel we may not be able to help specifically if it's again a cultural issue, while at the same time we can recognize the power and beauty of that person's impact, that person who is impacted of their culture, and connect with resources if appropriate. I think if whoever asked the question is thinking about, well, what can we do maybe from a policy perspective when it comes to religious or cultural, marriages, I think that's an entire like session in itself that we would want to uh, deep dive with other parties present before we provide maybe like additional guidance. But what we have seen from many partners is truly taking that authentic, of community, grassroots approach to shaping their own community, shaping their own religion. Um, and that has been much better received than anyone else, an outsider, for lack of other words, coming in, telling folks what to do. Alex, is there something there from your policy work that perhaps you'd like to add, or do you feel that's, or your work with many of the child marriage advocates that you'd like to add?
This is an issue that has been raised a number of times in the policy space, and I think it is something that policymakers are just beginning to come to grips with. A bill just passed in California that will fund a study of the issue of extra-legal marriages, they call it. And so I'm hopeful that we may learn a bit more about what that looks like in the United States, or at least in California, once that study is complete. And this similarly is an issue that other countries have started to address legally as well. I believe the UK recently passed a law trying to address this issue, and so that is something else where we can engage with advocates in this space in other countries to see what lessons they've learned while we consider public policy responses here in the United States.
Thank you, Alex. Uh, Not sure if there's other questions, but Bree, if you could, given that we are at time, and thank all of you for sticking with us, if you'd like to maybe drop the Survey Monkey, that would be really helpful. And I am happy to stay on and continue to go through the Q&A and continue to record this piece so that the full Q&A is included for anyone who may need to leave early. And I am happy to still share screen to show the tool that we will be sending as part of the materials that will go along with the recording. And so, Bree or Alex, is there another question or comment that may have been asked or shared earlier that we'd like to take some time to discuss a bit?
Hi. It's not necessarily a question, but more of a comment about you should inform them of their marriage is considered void in religion. Culture and religion are used as weapons of violence.
Thank you. I think it is really powerful to remember that with many forms of gender-based violence, spiritual abuse occurs, and it certainly occurs with forced marriage. I know that we have seen examples of, um, I was, I know that we have seen examples of folks being told that they are going against God or that God wants them, to marry. And that is really scary for folks to think not only I'm going against my own family, but, God. And sometimes this, they may feel that potentially they are, if rejecting the marriage may also mean rejecting their faith, which is not the case, right? And so again, this is a whole, I think, session in itself, and really do appreciate folks bringing this up. And Gamila, I see that you're in the chat. Thank you. If you'd like to include more in the chat, you're more than welcome to. Yeah, thank you so much for that. Bree, I believe that we received a question to our email, not necessarily about, it was not at all actually about religion, but it did name culture. And so I'm wondering if you would not, if you could at least drop it in the chat with the answer that you had drafted, just to ensure that we included. And if there's other questions that perhaps were already asked that we either sure we have those in the Q&A area or include those in the chat. Yeah. And while Bree is doing that, Alex, is there anything else that came up related to perhaps your session or anything at all that we may have missed?
Um, Not in particular. I think, again, I know I did a very high-level overview of laws that differ across every single state in the US. And so I would again invite anyone who's interested in learning more about how their particular state addresses the issue of forced and child marriage, please do reach out. I'm happy to have that conversation on a more granular level, as it's helpful.
Yeah. Thank you. Thank you. And Bri, I really appreciate you also dropping in those additional questions that we had received. And so I see that we still have quite a large amount of folks with us, and I would love to take this time to share screen of the tool that we have been working on with the hopes that service providers across uh, you know, um, you know, levels, agencies, you name it, disciplines are able to better able to screen. And, it's not necessarily a perfect tool, but I do think it is a wonderful guide. So if you give me just a second, I will pull that up for folks. And confirming with my team that everything looks okay on your end. Thank you. And so, apologies if you catch me looking aside. This is where I have the actual document. We're very excited to share this guide for recognizing and supporting individuals impacted by forced marriage. This is a a document created with, I think, lots of care and attention to what individuals impacted may be coming forward to service providers with, and also as a tool for service providers to be able to either incorporate directly or um, pull from for their own intake and assessment documents. So I'm going to just glide through it. We have sections related to broad impact and the spectrum of violence. I will name that we did not focus specifically on certain populations. We are really giving, a broad, I think, impact, but certainly have named some critical considerations such as working with LGBTQIA plus survivors and what we have noted from our work with immigrant survivors. So I am not going to scroll through the entire document because you are going to receive that, but I did want to note a couple of areas that I think are really helpful for screening and assessment. And so we have a section on screening where we also included some common technology need or safety needs around technology that are common. I think that by now you've heard us say many a times that this is a type of abuse that often is perpetrated by family members, right? And so it is very common for those impacted to be tracked or monitored via the technology, via the device that their family has given to them. And so we want to ensure to give at least some indication to folks of tech safety. And have also noted that for longer, more detailed support, we have linked to the National Network to End Domestic Violence, the technology program there. As I move ahead, I here highlighting for folks just some of the intake questions that could be incredibly helpful for you all to consider either in having an intake that's, forced marriage specific, or perhaps incorporating some of this in your current screening or intake processes. And of course, we've started with introducing yourself and the mandates around confidentiality, not assuming that we all are working with those who are lawful adults. I'm scrolling through slightly to share that we have included some additional tips regarding technology, which I'm very excited about. These relate to messaging. These relate to, social media and ways that in our work with those impacted, like really the 10 plus years of work, what we have been able to capture as ways that individuals who do leave home or who do seek shelter, like how they have been found or monitored or tracked. I think lastly, I will name a unique piece of this document is the family mapping section, which goes into asking questions about those who live in the home, and it gives more information as to why you would want to ask those questions, right? Questions about how decisions are made in the family, the who exactly is, pressing or forcing or pressuring the person into the relationship they do not want. And it also asks questions regarding who are the folks in the family that perhaps have power, for lack of other words, over these, decisions. So I think that is very unique to us, and unique in from other intake or assessment processes. Lots of really wonderful information. I am very, very excited and proud of this document. I think it'll be a wonderful tool, and we truly hope that folks see this as a way of incorporating more about onset of marriage, the support that folks deserve and should have, and that you, of course, see us as a resource for training, for technical assistance, for that one-on-one support. But again, even to evaluate those your own, intake and screening protocols. And so thank you for sticking it out with us. I want to make sure that folks have plenty of opportunity to chat further with us. I see we still have about 60 folks on the line. And so I will welcome my colleagues, Brianna and Alex, to join me again. And think we have the chat fully accessible to everyone, and we'll just pause to see if there's anything that anyone would like to either name, highlight, share, anything at all. Happy to have this extra time together. And Reed, thank you to you. I see that you included in the chat a flyer. This is a flyer that names our training and technical assistance. It includes our contact information. I believe we've included that in the chat several times, but I will do so again, or at least our email, so folks are sure to have that. So, uh, seeing a lot of thank yous, and we are certainly filled with gratitude for all of you being here. We can't galvanize a response to this issue without you all. And so I truly appreciate uh, you all being with us and caring about this work and recognizing that survivors of forced marriage are everywhere and likely within your caseloads. And whatever we can do as the Forced Marriage Initiative to support you all in recognizing the connection with the maybe primary harm that you are working on, please do let us know. I will name, I think, a couple more things and then close us out, seeing that we do not have any other questions. Um, we will have a private round table discussion on November 19th. This will be for emergency shelter rapid rehousing or like housing providers. And this is a way of really coming together to better identify, uh, well, maybe not even identify, actually, I should say, to find out ways to remove barriers to access for those impacted by forced marriage. And so if you're interested in that private session, if you are a housing service provider or work in the housing policy space, please do email us and we are happy to chat further. We are just in the beginning phases of planning that virtual convening. And of course, we will have a set of trainings in the spring. Some are culturally specific based on the feedback we have received from many of you. Some will be including the facilitation with survivor advocates. And so I'm very excited for those opportunities. So um, looking forward to seeing the responses from the survey. We will email the link to the webinar once we have corrected, made edits to the closed caption, and we will be sure to include the guide, the tool that we are very excited to share with you all. Please truly let us know any feedback so that we can improve our trainings, our materials. Let us know what you may need. We're here to help. And with that, I think I will say bye to everyone. Thank you. No. Gracias, Magdalena. Gracias, Corina. Thank you all. Well, thank you, team. This was wonderful. I am going to stop the recording now.